I wonder how my YouTube channel's doing. I haven't posted in a little bit. But, I think it's probably doing pretty good. I should probably start working. Oh, no. Oh, it's been a month. I have been slacking. Oh, no. Jokes aside, I am now making the 4th video. Hopefully I'll speed this up a little bit, although I'm probably going to have to stop talking about this in every video, otherwise it's going to be my brand new intro, which is probably not a good thing. But in my defense, I was playing Species Unknown. It's so good. Roll the clips. I've got proof.
I also got it.
Did Bert get sucked in the black hole? Oh. Oh.
Man, Mason, I hope nothing bad ever happens. I'm on Sam. Leave me behind, man! Go!
Okay, go.
It can't be the only area we need to go.
Also just head tap me.
It might genuinely just be over for me, low-key.
I did not think there was fucking fire.
Getting a lot of
Dude,
hand.
this should be light, Austin.
It should be light, yeah.
Watch me.
No, don't say that. That's right. Dude.
And some Lords of the Fallen to be safe too, I suppose. I did do that.
My god, my HP!
Did you see that? Did you see that? And now that those extremely necessary clips are out of the way, here I'm actually going to finish up the 4-part series that this channel has started with. That being the general intro to the lore of Conquest. Last time we left off with the rise of Hazia and eventually the Northern Crusades with the Nords. But this time we're going to get more into the downfall of the Dominion. And yeah, it's an interesting story, so I'll get right into it. The fall was a gradual process. Kick-started with the Northern Campaign, and while Yggdrasil may have been burned and its pantheon destroyed, so had 4 of the legions, something that would send the Dominion into turmoil. These legions had been taken from the most stable and safe portions of the Dominion, but their absence would soon see that status changed in time. The biggest drive of the fall, however, wasn't the legions. It was Hazia's disappearance after the Crusade. A nation founded and directly led by their god was now suddenly alone, with its human leaders left baffled as slowly their prayers went unanswered. But here I should probably go on a bit of a side tangent, and I should have gone on last episode. There's a group in the Dominion known as the Bred, hybrids of human and animal, specifically horse, goat, and cattle. These were creatures made by the Spires as a sort of gift to the newly growing empire. Of course, though, this wasn't out of the kindness of their hearts. They were meant to slowly destroy the Dominion, or at least weaken them, but Spires can do no wrong, therefore, These Bred were used as a slave caste, forced to work on farms or as messengers and servants. There were 4 types of Bred in total: satyrs, minotaurs, centaurs, and a 4th mysterious group that we don't really know anything about. The satyrs were the most intelligent of the 3 that we know about, which caused quite a bit of friction between them and humans, causing them to not really be as present in cities. Minotaurs were originally made to work in agriculture, but the Dominion, seeing how strong they were, slowly had them conditioned for battle. The greatest of them would become Bucephaloi. Spelling on screen, because I don't know if that's right. But that being said, they were devout guardians of the holiest sites of Hazia. They'd even cut off their own horns as an act of devotion. The 3rd group, the Centaurs, were the most disliked of the Bred. They were extremely unfaithful, not really religious in any way. And I don't mean they were iffy on it. They were literally genetically coded to be that way. In an empire built on and led by faith, they were practically alone in their disbelief. As such, they quickly became outcasts, only living on the outskirts of the Dominion. Here they would form nomadic groups, raiding and stealing from the countryside. Eventually, a solution would be found in the form of the Kirkis, where centaurs would be forcibly conscripted into faith and service when they were young, losing their free will in the process. They'd act as messengers in combat and messengers between temples. They might outwardly have shown faith to Hazia to appease their masters, But deep down, though, they still didn't really believe in any of it. No amount of indoctrination could force them into belief, despite the Dominion's best efforts, just as the Spires had made them. The fourth and final bred species doesn't have any real information about them, as it was all lost. That, or someone somewhere, is keeping the information about them hidden for one reason or another. What is known is the Dominion didn't really interact with them much for one reason or another. Altogether, the bred are an interesting bunch. Hybrids sent to both help and eventually weaken the Dominion as a whole. They become important in the game itself, with two different factions being able to field them, but we'll have to get to that towards the end of this video, because some things happen before we get to the actual modern day Avia. The human leader of the Dominion was known as the Kelsur, or that was their title anyway, as it was passed down. This title was divinely appointed. Without Hazia, the rule had no real backing to it, no authority. After the failed Northern Crusade, not only was their patron missing, but without Hazia, the failures of the Northern Crusade fell solely onto the Kelsur. That Kelsur was soon ousted from their position and replaced, but without Hazia to officiate the position of the new Kelsur, their position was shaky at best, something that would be his and many more Kelsur's downfall. The biggest contributors to this gradual decline were the various Kelsurs, the remaining legions, and the Collegia, which I'll get to soon. With the 4 legions lost, instability in the lands they were meant to protect followed, stirring unrest in the Dominion. Not only were there large portions of the Empire no longer guarded by the legions, but also serious political unrest from the Kelsurs. In time, the Kelsurs would be in such a bad spot, it was said they'd be a new one each season as each was deposed. I'm no expert in politics here, but you know what, call me crazy. That sounds like a pretty bad thing. With the rising political unrest, the church declared the bred to be at fault for it all, using them as a scapegoat. And I'd imagine the conversation went a little something along the lines of, hey man, we really need to find a way, we need some kind of scapegoat to put all this blame on, lest it fall on us. And the other guy was like, say that again. I know just the right guy. And guess what? The citizens ate it up, quickly blaming the bred for everything that had and what was going wrong. The bred, not understanding, soon fell victims to this anger, with their populations being decimated over the coming years from various acts of violence. But, as I'm sure we could all guess, these killings were far from a solution, as the work the bred did on farms was necessary to the Dominion, and the obvious fact that they were not the reason for any of the bad things that had been happening. Soon the Dominion turned to slave labor. This time, not of the bred though, but of other humans. Of course, human slavery caused even more civil unrest, resulting in riots, which were then forcibly put down by the government using the remaining legions, causing, you guessed it, more civil unrest. At the time, Kelsur began to pull back the remaining legions on the outskirts of the Dominion towards Capitus, though one of them refused, the 12th Legion. They are super important and have their own story just about them, which I highly recommend reading, but for the sake of time, I'll sadly have to leave it out of this video, though hopefully at some point I'll be able to give it a dedicated video. That being said, the 12th Legion held their post, protecting the border, allowing refugees of the Dominion to flee west, as more people seeing this political violence, unrest, and instability were beginning to see the signs, and some of them began to flee. The 12th Legion, unlike the other legions, worshipped a single specific god, that being Cleon, which was not allowed. But they were skilled enough and far enough that no one really went to stop them. That being said, that secret was well known enough for them to be shipped off to protect the far reaches of the Empire to the west. When the Kelsur called for his legions, the 12th did not listen, deciding to hold their post and help the refugees who were running. So the Kelsur sent 2 legions to have them removed, fearing their insubordination and how it might make their power even more fractured and unstable. The 4th and 17th legions were sent to stop the 12th. The 4th Legion was one of the oldest, one steeped in the older traditions that came with that. The 17th Legion, however, was newly formed and eager to prove themselves. They'd both been sent to destroy the 12th Legion. However, one thing was a little odd with this arrangement, as for political reasons the Kelsur had the 17th lead the more experienced 4th to fight the 12th Legion. After some inconclusive battles, the 4th realized the Kelsur meant to have them destroyed while fighting the 12th to ensure loyalty in what remained. So they betrayed them and joined the 12th together, then destroyed the 17th. This ended up proving the Kelsur's fear of insubordination and betrayal to be right. As a result, he had the remaining legions under his command disbanded, This has effectively removed what authority he had left, as he disbanded the people that is meant to actually enforce his authority. That was not the best choice. Unrest became worse and worse as each and every one of these things began to pile on. The various religious groups of the Dominion, once united by Hazia, began to turn on one another. Hazia had worked hard to have so many diverse groups of worshippers, each worshipping him in new ways. Before the fall, each had been a boon, giving him new and unique strengths for each new type of worship. Hazia had helped establish some of these splinter groups, all practicing in different ways. Now those same groups turned on each other, those differences that Hazia once nurtured now splitting them apart. Some groups fought in violent clashes. Smaller cults slinked off to the corners of the Dominion, or otherwise laid low. One man, though, was at fault for escalating things even further, that being the then Kelser, Manuel II, helming the idea of a holy war against the Spires. After all, they were the ones who'd given them the bread. While, yes, those bread had been meant to destabilize Dominion in the long term, they were certainly not at fault for the current issues they were struggling with. And the fact that, needless to say, that is an awful idea, and that's not just because I really like the Spires. If you're already experiencing political turmoil, you don't try to fight some of the most dangerous neighbors you have. With their legions disbanded, the Dominion had much more mishmashed armies, not nearly as efficient as the legions they'd once had, and marched them against both the Spires and the Weavers, so both groups of exiles. And while they were able to kill many of the exiles who had been caught out in the open, their retaliation would be devastating. The Weavers would send out war hosts, and the Spires released beasts from their menageries, all while piecing together still worse creatures. The countrysides of the Dominion, who were near these spires and near these woods, would be decimated as a result. Once the war began, more refugees had to flee west, even if that was where a decent amount of the fighting was happening, as the 12th fought both Dominion forces and exile warbands. In this time, even Cleon had left the 12th Legion like Hazia had left the Dominion. That would be the least of their coming troubles, though. Eventually, the Kelser banned migration. Anyone caught doing so would be drafted to the front lines, a complete meat grinder as an unprepared civilian turned soldiers were slaughtered by spire-grown monsters and the beasts of the Weavers. The Dwome would never allow themselves to be left out from this, though. After all, they were Wars Chosen, and they had enough of fighting one another over the memory wars, at least for now. They marched out in force to put the others in their places. It is around this time that the Spires decided they should develop a new race, a race meant to fight their wars, one they wouldn't have to manage like they did their drones and clones, self-sufficient warriors that could be called upon to do the Spires' bidding. They would eventually become to be called the Wadrun. The Wadrun were initially created as a self-sustaining vanguard force for the Spires. This will allow them to not have to continuously grow more of them in vats. In a rare case of unity, many of the best biomancers met at a single spire to the west of the Dominion, known as Abhorreth. For this project, they tried something new, making a new organism, with no exile DNA at all. Instead, they took or recreated aspects of other creatures, combining them to develop this new perfect organism. But when they created something from scratch, like they were here, they encountered a new, unforeseen issue. They weren't awake. These creatures that they had been meaning to make were just bodies, and these bodies they were making had no awareness. They were just empty husks. Eventually, though, something odd would happen. 4 of these bodies would awaken, 2 female and 2 male. Though how exactly was unknown to the Spires. Could it be the human DNA they spliced in? Perhaps the reptile? But they weren't sure. Though one idea held a bit more weight. One radical experiment that had taken place was trying to fuse the primeval essences, aka the 4 horsemen, famine, conquest, war, and death. But even then, they weren't sure. Of the major factions, the Spires have the weakest grasp on action of any of them. They might have mastery of biology, and biomancy may seem like magic, but the magic the dragons and other factions wield is completely alien to them, so much so that they've given up on trying to recreate in biology at all. Though, one thing we do know, though, in retrospect is, yeah, it was the 4 horsemen. Some aspect or piece of them merged with the Wadrun in some way, and they can be seen in their descendants in modern Conquest, where if you even look at their different gameplay mechanics, they have chants, which all rely on famine, conquest, war, and death. So, well, they clearly got something right, but they weren't sure how they did it, or what did it necessarily. When the 4 prime specimens awoke, they were quickly placed into stasis for preservation by the biomancers, lest this new discovery be lost. It seemed that the primeval essence had affected their bodies, but when taking samples and recreating what they believed to have happened, nothing happened. Just more empty bodies. The biomancers then began a sort of breeding program to get more after they had failed to recreate them. This was a success, though. From here, they culled those too strong or who otherwise fell out of the parameters of the objective, and it was during this time something unforeseen happened. The Dwome emerged to restart their war with the Exiles, and now humanity as well. The Weavers and Spires, seeing them for what they were, quickly withdrew from direct confrontations, leaving several hosts of Dwome to turn to the central provinces of the Dominion instead, towards Capitus. The Dwome spread throughout the Dominion, attacking humans and exiles alike. The exiles feared that the Dwome and humans may form an alliance to destroy them, so they amassed still greater hosts and forged still more vicious monsters to eliminate one of the threats while they could: the humans. Of course, we know the Dwome would never form an alliance. They would just fight everyone. So the Dominion caught the brunt of the war with no upside, being attacked from all angles. In an interesting twist, though, the Dwome held a certain kinship, or at least sympathy, for the Bread. Both were creatures of biomancy, forced into servitude. The Dwecome's violence against the Dominion was at least partially a result of this, though certainly not the only reason. A great host of the aforementioned Dwome marched on Haboreth, the spire where the Wadrun were being made. The exile researchers of the spire saw how hopeless the situation was, so they quickly began to gather the research to flee, sending out the Wadrun as decoys to temporarily defend the spire from the Dwome. It was a massacre. While the exiles fled, the Wadrun were cut down, organized and ill-prepared. That's when the last biomancers who were leaving released the primes. In mere days, they had organized and were leading the Wadrun against the Dwome. It was still a losing fight, but now they had a chance. A small chance, but a chance. In the final battle between the Dwome and Wadrun, most of the Wadrun and 3 of the primes fought to distract the Dwome, while the final and smartest of the primes punched through the Dwome line, allowing her and some of the remaining Wadrun to make it through and flee. There were no other survivors. Here, starvation would claim many of them, as their large forms need a lot of food to survive, something that these wastelands simply didn't offer. And, not long after that, to add to their struggle, came the fall. As this all continued to unfold, 2 people began to realize what had happened to Hazia. The reason all this chaos had begun in the first place was because Hazia had gone mad. They were the twin heads, though I don't think they were actually twins, of the Collegia. The Collegia is what it sounds like, the greatest collection of knowledge the Dominion wielded. Knowledge of the Spires, Weavers, Dwome, anything and everything the Dominion could get their hands on. The twin heads, Constantius and Alexander, would need this knowledge if they wanted to try and save humanity from Hazia's madness. Alexander's origins are shrouded in mystery, but Constantius is one we know about. Constantius was once a butcher's apprentice named Plato, nothing more. In time, though, he managed to rise to the ranks of the Collegia, eventually taking up the name Constantius. The Collegia as a whole began to contribute to the chaos, selling their services for money or favors. These mysterious dealings were all to fuel the plans of the twin heads as they accelerated their plans, seeing the writing on the wall. The Dominion didn't have much time left. The twin heads had 2 very different approaches, though. Constantius would soon begin to compile resources in a new project to found new cities, away from the Dominion and away from Hazia. He slowly began to shuttle knowledge and the most accomplished scholars he could in secret. They would flee the Dominion, hiding among the refugees going to the west. They'd take the knowledge of the Dominion with them, not only with their skills, but also bringing secretly made copies of books from the Voludum, which is the largest library that the Dominion had, and the one that the Collegia controlled. Slowly piecing together his master plan, something that would eventually culminate in something called the City-States, one of the major factions of Conquest. The other Collegia head, though, Alexander, had a much different plan. He delved deep into forbidden knowledge the Collegia had to offer, and eventually he found what he was looking for: the knowledge on how to kill a god. In the time he was researching, though, he slowly came to fear his own craft, and eventually abandoned his research. Even without having finished his works, his hubris gave him the title of the Anathematic. His name was nearly lost to history, with the Anathematic being all he was known as. And, for those wondering, Anathematic means either hateful or loathsome. So, yeah, even without having succeeded, people did not like Alexander, once they'd found out what he'd been researching. The faculty of the Collegia weren't oblivious to all that was happening, though. and in time they came to the same conclusion that Constantinius and Alexander had, that Hazia had gone mad. They would pick up where Alexander had left off, and together they would do something that'd reshape Ea forever. 100 of them, the most powerful archmages the Dominion had to offer, gathered in Capitus. In the meantime, Constantinius' plans had to accelerate as the situation worsened. Before long, all pretenses of secrecy were dropped and libraries were sacked for as much as they could carry, fleeing with the knowledge of the Dominion. Together, these archmages did something unprecedented. They attacked Hazia directly and cast him from the heavens. They used the same faith that had bound Hazia to his followers and used it to pull him down. This would eventually become to be known as the Fall. Hazia's faithful looked to the skies and saw him coming down and cheered, overjoyed to see their god return to them. It was so awe-inspiring, even the remaining centaurs, genetically made to not believe, were struck with a moment of faith. And belief. And then fear. This moment would not last long. Hazia had gone insane, and he was angry. Not just angry, but truly enraged. Enraged by both the Archmage's betrayal and the perceived betrayal of his people. Hazia, for his iconography, used the rising sun as a way to represent himself. This reflects two key things about him. One, he was a shard of creation, and two, he wanted to be up in the sky with those other shards that were like him, as he was trapped on Ea by the same people who had given him everything. Without humanity, Hazia would be a burnt-out shard sitting at the bottom of the Dwome hold, but now that he had been worshipped and given all this power, he looked to the sky and wished to be up there. But he couldn't go up there because he was tied to his followers, so most he could do was sit in the sky. He was always so close to being able to go up to the stars with the other shards of creation, but he never could, and that's likely a contributing factor to what would come. Hazia would take his celestial palace with him when pulled down by the Archmages, directly over Capitus. This impact would have been so deadly that not only would have likely instantly killed almost every person immediately in the Dominion, but on top of that would shoot up a cloud of ash and dust and smoke so large that it'd cover the entire planet, choking out all life on it as no sunlight could make it through. And I don't directly quote much in these videos, if at all, but here I think it's only right I made an exception. The cataclysm that followed is what they call the Fall, and it happened as his faithful sang hymns, praising his return. Were it not for the efforts of the last legion and the sacrifices of both Nineveh and Cleon, humanity would have perished forever to the sound of its own cheers. That's so unbelievably cool. I love that line. I love the world of Conquest, and I feel like that really sums it up. When Hazia was falling, only one thing saved life on Ea. Nineveh. Told you she was important. She used what power she had to lessen the impact of the fall. Even then, though, the effect was devastating. Hazia punched through the earth, destroying Capitus and killing countless humans, bread, exile, and Dwome alike. The sky was full of ash, blocking out the sun, killing plants as night reigned. Even in Mannheim the effects were felt, the Nords speaking of the sky being shrouded, and a deep winter taking hold of the land. When Hazia was pulled from the sky by the Archmages, his rage and madness is what prompted him to turn into the Fall. That same rage is what prompted him to do something even more drastic when Nineveh, by slowing his descent to save life on Ea, inadvertently saved him. In his rage, he poured all his power to break open a certain prison. Death's prison. The Fourth Horseman. This should have been impossible. Death was a being far more powerful than Hazia, and Death had been trapped for eons. But the dragons were dead. This alone severely weakened the prison, not to mention the slow weakening of the prison over time. That and countless had also just died in a moment, killed by Hazia's impact to the earth, along with his palace. Hazia, with all his strength, tried to open the prison, and Death, too, tried to break free beneath. Hazia and Death would merge, an unholy union of creation and destruction, not blended like balance, but bound by hatred. Together they became something new, the Ungod. The Ungod screamed, an echoing cry so violent that he was shattered in the process. This cry would reach his places of worship and the corpses of those who had believed in Hazia in life. Here, the power of their faith and the power of death allowed those corpses to be reanimated. Even the centaurs, who had only believed for a mere moment before dying in the fall, were brought back from death. Each of these bodies had a tiny, tiny mote or shard of the Ungod in them, which was part of the reason they were able to reanimate. Those in the surviving provinces fled, Same goes for those on the outskirts of the Dominion. Many fled west, protected by the 12th Legion. They spoke of threats attacking them, desperate cannibals, raiders, and some even spoke the dead returning to life to kill the living. A notable threat wasn't mentioned, though. The Dwome. The Dwome hosts, who had begun to march towards Capitus, were lost. Completely. And even other Dwome don't know what happened to them, and it's a running mystery for the Dwome. Whether this was because they died in the impact, or what would come after, nobody knows. Cleon was there at the site of the impact and managed to save Nineveh, or at least her unconscious body, while culling what remained of Hazia's pantheon, as their tether to Hazia had pulled them all into his madness. Once they had all been slain, Cleon traveled west, warning the 12th Legion before collapsing. And it's here, for the sake of time, I'll skip over most of what happens here. In short, the 12th Legion shepherded what refugees they could before the wave of dead hit their walls. They'd withstand the siege with the aid of some Dwome citizens who would run after losing contact with the army that was meant to defend them. Together, they'd hold this mountain pass. For each zombie killed, though, that shard of the Ungod they carried would coalesce, allowing the Ungod to eventually retake consciousness, and eventually retake a form, allowing them to control their forces directly, not just as shambling drones wandering around, but as a real organized military force. Luckily for the 12th Legion, though, eventually Cleon would awake, challenging Hazia to a duel, something Hazia's pride drove him to accept, which Cleon knew it would. And it was here that Cleon was defeated by the Ungod, but the man who led the 12th Legion betrayed him for the good of everybody, using Cleon's previously given blessing to stab Cleon through the back and directly into the heart of Hazia, killing both of them. By having manifested true physical bodies, it killed the consciousness of both, effectively permanently killing both Cleon and the Ungod, as they had been pierced by an adamantine sword, made of the same ores Balance had created to fend off against the horsemen, namely famine. The power of Cleon and the Ungod still remained. The zombies didn't immediately all disappear. The Cleon's worshippers didn't lose the power he had given them. But Cleon himself and the Ungod were dead. Their power remained, but they were gone. The dead that remained returned to their shambling forms, no longer led by a greater will, except for a very select few. But even then, the danger to Io was over. The 12th Legion, with the Dwome, had saved the world. I know this is a very brief recap of what happened, but I don't think I'd ever manage to get this video out if I include the whole thing. That being said, though, I'd love to give this siege its own dedicated video at some point. It's a great story. So, if anyone here is interested in seeing that, let me know in the comments, and I'll be sure to bump it up on my to-do list for videos. During the fall, there's two main bastions holding back the dead. There was, obviously, the 12th Legion holding the mountain pass that we've been talking about, but there's also Desmoscurl. Desmoscurl sounds right, but I also still have no idea how to pronounce that. But point is, they were not just a one-off thing I mentioned last video. They're actually kind of important. Though how important, I guess, is still waiting to be seen. The guards of Desmoscurl were able to hold the walls and protect the prison. It not only was amazing for keeping the inmates in and what was locked down beneath, but also served as a good bastion. It held all the zombies outside until the point where the Ungod fell, and the zombies returned to mindless, shambling creatures. Really goes to show how great the people Hazia picked for that project was, because chances are they were not only attacked by zombies, but also potentially some of the undead and crazed deities that Hazia created. Whether or not they got attacked by those, though, isn't necessarily what's important, as they held the line. They held down the prison, and they won. They held out. But they were kind of left in a very strange spot, as they were the most fanatical and loyal people Hazia could find to him. And all of a sudden, he's dead, and evil, and dead again. And they're just sitting in the prison that he told them to watch, and all of a sudden he has zombies trying to kill him. But they don't know that either, so they're just so confused. I can only imagine. And I'm not going to get into it because it kind of goes outside of the boundaries of this video, but it gets even more confusing for them, and they go a little crazy after a little while. But once again, that's outside of the boundaries of this video. That's going to be in like a speculation style video that I'm planning on making, which I'm also really looking forward to making on just future factions and just important stuff. But yeah, for now, Desmos Cyril is their story is kind of complete for what this 4-part is covering. So, but yeah, their story is definitely an interesting one. All right, back to the main content though. There's about a 6th century time skip where the people who survived the fall and whatever was left kind of regrounded themselves and built back up. And after the 6 centuries is where modern Ea is, the actual game that we play. In time, the refugees of the Dominion who fled west under the protection of the 12th Legion established small towns, and after that, cities and kingdoms. At first, they were ruled by whoever was the strongest or wealthiest, be they nobles of the Dominion or thieves who had taken what they needed. When the 12th Legion went to them, though, they established order, establishing boundaries and laws. Today, it is much the same, though everything is much more established, with noble lines, religions founded on the fall and what was to be learned from it, and the legions, each formed by one or more members of the 12th Legion practicing their individual skills and philosophies. The knowledge and horrors of the Dominion now are mostly forgotten, whether by accident or willfully. Either way, they have become something entirely new. They would become to be known as the 100 Kingdoms. The spires remain mostly unchanged, though one development has certainly been interesting. Long has trade been prohibited by the sovereign between the spires and other races, but after tensions rose for various political reasons and people were starting to dislike them even more than they already did, he eventually gave in. He eventually gave the power of trade in the form of licenses to kind of get some of the heat off his back. Now, some members have left the spires in search of trade, becoming known as the Merchant Princes. The Dwome returned to their holds after the fall, returning to rebuild and continue their memory wars. This doesn't mean they'll stay gone for long, though. After all, they are the chosen of war, and will heed its call. Of the major factions, though, they are probably the least affected by the fall, as they lived underground. You don't really have to worry about a giant ashy winter when you're living in a mountain anyway, so they got it off relatively easy, besides, all the armies dying in Capitus. Those are gone, but for all the other Dwome, sure seem to be doing okay. As for the Nords, they were in a horrible place last we checked, but eventually one group would come to save them from the giants, the Ainyar. Only some awoke, and most had died in their sleep, and for those that remained, they were decades too late to fight in Ragnarok. But they did have one thing they could do. They went and liberated their less powerful kin, the Nords. They went to war with the giants, eventually winning. Now the Nords are able to rebuild, traveling north to explore and traveling south to raid. Their gods might be dead, but their spirits remain, fighting on the cold of Mannheim. Constantius would travel to the city-states he'd been building. Having stolen a small piece of Hazia's power, he began to rebuild. He wanted to build a future for humanity, one that no one could take away. He wanted to be an immortal philosopher king, to guide humanity, to build cities where various groups and cultures could thrive. He even allowed what bread remained to flee to the city-states. It's after the fall, making them the bread's only real bastion in modern Ea. He also made, quote, god seeds, small pieces of creation for each city to worship, turning each shard into its own fledgling deity to be the patron of the city. This gave the benefits of the divine without risking the madness Hazia had succumbed to. If one of these gods were to go mad, the issues they could cause would be relegated to a single city, and that city could seek help from any of the surrounding ones. On top of that, he used his knowledge he had to create and build bodies, a blend of the biological and mechanical. He performed a ritual with the power he had taken and split his soul apart into each of these bodies. It was a flawed process, though. Each became conscious, but were scarred by the process and imperfect. But for a time, they worked, each city having a council of these bodies, which would become known as the Scale, working as a council to keep one another in check. Together, they would try and lead each city. While not perfect, Plato had, at least in part, seen his vision realized as the city-states would become the farthest progressed human nation on Ea, building automata, creating grand pieces of art, and defending themselves from all the outside forces that surrounded them. During the fall, some of the surviving archmages, along with their servants, fled southeast. These powerful sorcerers were able to pull full islands out of the ocean in order to flee, chaining them together and letting them sink below as they got farther and farther from the mainland, till eventually, when far enough, they created a massive island, this time as their sanctuary. Only 4 archmages now remained: Ermi, Dylan, Hormus, and Alessa. Together, they would come to be known as the 4 Elder Sorcerer Kings. Those servants that had gone with them, they bound to the primordial elements, earth, water, fire, and air. Together, they created the most magically inclined faction in Conquest, the Sorcerer Kings. It is on this island they would stay, content to live in a corner of the world, an isolated nation, free from the conflicts they had fled. In time, the Wadrun would establish themselves. With the Dwome gone, they went back to the spire that had birthed them. Spires naturally collect minerals and nutrients, but now that this one was destroyed, it began to leak to the surrounding land, turning the once barren soil into a thriving oasis. Some Wadrun even delved deep into the spire, releasing ancient beasts the spire had been studying and developing. And yes, those creatures were dinosaurs. In this oasis, they began to form communities, with the one prime that remained having left them to search the world. They may be the youngest of the races, but they are far from weak, ready to carve their place in the world. Now this faction is a bit of a curveball here. When exactly the hosts trapped within balance were able to escape is unknown, but what is known is that at some point, the hosts of both War and Conquest finally found a way out of their prison, through the ascendancy of the Eternal Pagoda. One of them, who would become known as Shuten Joji, or the Twice-Masked Prince, found a way out of their prison. A group of humans were worshipping the 5 elements, the 5th being the Void. He used this worship of the Void as a tether to climb up and reach the top. When he passed, the tether grew greater and another one climbed it, then larger, then more, then larger, then still more. The Uroni aimed for discipline and ascension through it. Eventually, the small line would become the Eternal Pagoda, and each layer was like its own realm that each of the Uroni would have to pass through in order to reach ascendancy and enlightenment. However, there was a small crack at the top of the pagoda that led to Ia itself, but only the most enlightened were capable of going through, and those were very, very few. But for some reason, that crack is beginning to widen, and more Uroni are crossing to Ia. As the second newest faction, they also don't have a ton of lore as to what they're up to now. But what they are is extremely interesting, and I can't wait to give them their own video in time. The Weavers return to their woods, participating in court life and enjoying nature. Truth be told, they don't get up to too much, due to their being an isolationist group, and also they are the newest faction, though I am also looking forward to what gets revealed for them in the future and what they'll do. And now for the final faction, the Old Dominion. Those few undead who retained their consciousness and sense of self began to control the dead around them. Those that retained their consciousness were mainly those most faithful to Hazia, and as such they strive to bring back the Ungod. They have spent the time since the fall excavating and planning, digging up tombs of long-lost armies of Hazia's faithful to add to their armies. Some become anointed, powerful with the magic of the Ungod. Meanwhile, long-dead gods of Hazia's making are awakening, being reborn after death like their mortal followers. That and death cults are spreading around the world, be they small groups in the 100 Kingdoms or people on the fringes of the Old Dominion. People who still worship Hazia, or the Ungod, or both. And there it is. That is the, I guess, basic intro to Conquest, or at the very least the wider setting. And this is the point now where I could say I am very excited to start working on individual faction videos, because I'm hoping at some point that each of these factions will have a story breakdown and lore breakdown on this channel that's, as in-depth as I can really go, and it's just focus on them. And I thought it's only right that I do this with a wheel. Okay, believe it or not, that was not the edited version. I was planning on spinning this wheel until I got the spires, and then being like, "Whoa! I can't believe I got the spires! Whoa!" I had not intended to get it first try. Either way, next video it's gonna be about the spires. I don't know how long it's gonna take, but it's gonna be a full deep dive into the tiny little details of that faction, even going into some of the model designs and the wider implications of that. All right, I gotta probably start sitting down and working on this. I am very excited for this video. So, yeah, I'll get to it. Hope everybody enjoyed, and see you in hopefully a reasonable amount of time before the next video is out. Thank you, and bye.